The piercing scream shattered the silence of the Park Mansion at exactly 3:17 a.m. Grace Thompson bolted upright in her small bedroom, her heart racing as the sound echoed through the marble hallways. In her month working for the Park family, she had never heard 12-year-old Hae-jin make any sound at all. Grace's bare feet hit the cold floor as she rushed down the dimly lit corridor toward Hae-jin's room. The scream came again, raw and desperate, filled with 3 years of trapped pain finally breaking free. Grace pushed open the bedroom door to find Hae-jin standing by the massive window, her small frame silhouetted against the Seoul city lights, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Mama, don't leave me!" The words tumbled out between sobs, the first sounds the child had made since the accident that stole her voice and her mother. Grace approached slowly, her psychology training kicking in despite her shock. She had been hired just 4 weeks ago as the 7th caretaker to attempt the impossible task of caring for the silent child. Unlike the others who had failed before her, Grace understood trauma in ways that textbooks couldn't teach. "Hae-jin," Grace whispered softly, her Nigerian accent gentle in the darkness. "I'm here, sweetheart." The girl turned, her dark eyes wide with confusion and fear. For a moment, she seemed surprised by her own voice, touching her throat as if checking that the words had really come from her. Then, as quickly as the breakthrough had come, silence returned. Hae-jin's lips pressed together tightly, and she shook her head violently, as if trying to push the words back inside. Grace knelt down to Hae-jin's level, careful not to move too quickly. "It's okay to speak, little one. Your mama would want you to use your beautiful voice." But Hae-jin had already retreated back into her silent world, wrapping her arms around herself protectively. Grace helped her back to bed, humming a soft lullaby her own mother had sung to her in Lagos years ago. As Hae-jin finally drifted back to sleep, Grace sat in the chair beside her bed, processing what had just happened. 1 month earlier, Grace had arrived at the imposing Park Mansion with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of hope. The employment agency had warned her about the position, caring for a traumatized child whose selective mutism had defeated 6 previous caretakers. The pay was generous, almost too generous, which should have been her first warning about how difficult the job would be. Park Joon-ho had interviewed her in his sterile home office, his handsome face marked by exhaustion and grief. At 35, he was one of Korea's most successful businessmen, but Grace could see the broken father beneath the expensive suit. He had barely looked at her during the interview, his attention constantly pulled to his phone and the endless stream of business calls. "Miss Thompson, my daughter hasn't spoken in 3 years. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong with her. She just chooses not to speak. Can you help her?" Grace had seen the desperation in his dark eyes, the same look she had worn when searching for help for her own younger brother back in Nigeria. "Mr. Park, I can't promise she'll speak again, but I can promise I'll love her like she's my own while I try." That promise had sealed her fate. For 4 weeks, she had worked patiently with Hae-jin, using art therapy, music, and gentle presence instead of the aggressive speech therapy approaches that had failed before. She had learned to read her expressions, to understand her needs without words, to see the brilliant mind trapped behind the wall of silence. The mansion felt like a beautiful prison, all marble floors and expensive furniture, but no warmth, no laughter, no life. Joon-ho worked 18-hour days, leaving before Hae-jin woke and returning after she slept. His mother, the stern grandmother Park, watched Grace with suspicious eyes, clearly disapproving of the foreign woman caring for her precious granddaughter. But tonight, something had changed. Tonight, Hae-jin had spoken. As Grace finally returned to her room, she wondered what had triggered the breakthrough and whether the fragile progress would survive the morning light.
3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. That's how long it had been since Hei-jin's world went silent. Grace counted the days as she watched the little girl pick at her breakfast, the same way she had counted the days since her own brother's death. Some tragedies marked time differently, splitting life into before and after. The morning sun streamed through the dining room's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished table where Hei-jin sat alone. Her father had already left for his office at dawn, as he did every day. Grandmother Park sipped her tea in disapproving silence, occasionally glancing at Grace with cold eyes. "She spoke last night," Grace said quietly, breaking the tension. Grandmother Park's teacup clinked against its saucer. "Impossible! The child hasn't made a sound since the accident. You must have been dreaming." Grace met the older woman's gaze steadily. "I heard her clearly. She called for her mother." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Hei-jin's chopsticks froze halfway to her mouth, her small body tensing at the mention of her mother. Grace watched as the girl's eyes filled with the familiar, distant look that meant she was remembering. It had happened on a Tuesday evening in October. Grace had pieced together the story from whispered conversations between the household staff and the medical files Dr. Lee had reluctantly shared. Hei-jin had been playing on the apartment balcony of their old home while her mother prepared dinner. Jun-ho was working late again, chasing another business deal that seemed more important than family time. The accident happened so fast that even the security cameras barely captured it. A drunk driver ran a red light, slamming into Mrs. Park's car as she returned from the grocery store. The vehicle flipped twice before bursting into flames, just 50 meters from where Hei-jin stood watching. The little girl had screamed then, screaming for her mother until her voice was raw. She had screamed as the firefighters worked desperately to reach the burning car. She had screamed as her father finally arrived, his face white with horror. She had screamed until the moment they told her that her mother was gone, and then she never made another sound. Dr. Lee called it selective mutism, triggered by severe trauma. The medical term felt cold and clinical compared to the reality Grace witnessed every day. Hei-jin hadn't just lost her voice, she had lost her trust in the world, her belief that speaking could change anything or save anyone. 6 caretakers had tried and failed before Grace arrived. Miss Chen had lasted 3 weeks before declaring Hei-jin impossible to reach. Miss Johnson, a British nanny with 20 years of experience, had quit after 2 months, claiming the child was deliberately stubborn. The others had tried everything from strict discipline to excessive pampering, but none had understood that Hei-jin's silence wasn't defiance, it was protection. Grace understood because she had built her own walls after losing her brother Kemi in a drowning accident back home. She knew how guilt could steal your voice, how survivor's shame could make you feel unworthy of comfort or joy. The difference was that Grace was 25 when tragedy struck. Hei-jin was only 9. The doctors said she might never speak again, Grandmother Park continued, her voice sharp with old pain. They said the trauma was too severe, that we should accept it and move on. Doctors don't know everything, Grace replied gently, watching as Hei-jin pushed rice around her bowl without eating. Sometimes healing takes longer than medical textbooks suggest. Jun-ho had thrown himself into work after the accident, building his electronics empire into one of Korea's most successful companies. Grace suspected his 18-hour workdays weren't just about business success. They were about avoiding the empty spaces where his wife's laughter used to live, the silence where his daughter's voice should be. The guilt was eating him alive. Grace could see it in the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching, in the way he avoided looking directly at Hei-jin during their brief encounters. He blamed himself for working late that night, for not being there to drive his wife to the store, for not protecting his family when they needed him most. As Grace helped Hei-jin finish her breakfast, she wondered if last night's breakthrough was the beginning of healing or just a cruel tease. Either way, she was determined to help this broken family find their way back to each other, one silent day at a time.
Grace's hands trembled slightly as she unpacked her art supplies in Hei-jin's playroom. The morning light revealed what she had missed in the darkness, dozens of drawings scattered across the floor, each one telling a story that words couldn't express. She picked up a crayon sketch of a little girl standing behind glass, her mouth covered by shadows. "You've been trying to tell us something all along, haven't you?" Grace whispered to herself. The truth was, Grace understood Hei-jin's silence better than anyone in the Park household could imagine. 2 years ago, she had held her 7-year-old brother Kemi as he drowned in the Lagos lagoon, his small hand slipping from hers in the murky water. For months afterward, Grace had barely spoken, the weight of survivor's guilt crushing her voice into whispers. That's what had driven her to study child psychology at the University of Lagos, and later what had brought her to Korea. She needed to prove to herself that she could save someone, that her failure to save Kemi didn't define her worth as a human being. Unlike the previous caretakers who had tried to force Hei-jin to speak through rewards and punishments, Grace approached the child like a wounded bird that needed patience, not pressure. She spread out colored pencils and blank paper on the low table, then sat quietly, waiting. Hei-jin entered the room cautiously, her dark eyes scanning Grace's face for any sign of expectation or demand. When she saw only gentle acceptance, she moved closer to the art supplies, her fingers hovering over a red crayon. "Colors have voices too," Grace said softly, picking up a blue pencil. "Sometimes they can say things our mouths can't." For the next hour, they drew in comfortable silence. Grace sketched the view from her childhood bedroom window in Lagos, palm trees swaying against an orange sunset. Hei-jin watched intently, then began her own drawing. Grace's heart nearly stopped when she saw what emerged on the paper. It was a car, twisted and burning, with a small figure watching from above. But this time there was something new, another figure standing beside the child, holding her hand. The second figure had dark skin and kind eyes that looked remarkably like Grace's own. "Is that us?" Grace asked gently. Hei-jin nodded, then quickly looked away, as if surprised by her own response. It was the first direct communication she had made with any caretaker since the accident. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sharp click of heels on marble. Grandmother Park entered the playroom, her disapproval evident in every line of her rigid posture. "What is this mess?" she demanded, surveying the scattered drawings. Hei-jin should be practicing her calligraphy, not playing with crayons like a baby. Grace stood slowly, keeping her voice respectful but firm. "Art therapy is a recognized treatment for trauma, Mrs. Park. Hei-jin is processing her emotions through these drawings." "Nonsense," the older woman snapped. "What this child needs is discipline and structure, not indulgence from a foreign girl who doesn't understand our ways." The words stung, but Grace had faced worse prejudice during her studies in Korea. She had learned to let ignorance roll off her like water, focusing instead on the children who needed her help. "With respect, Mrs. Park, I have a degree in child psychology and 3 years of experience working with traumatized children. Hei-jin is making progress." "Progress?" Grandmother Park's laugh was bitter. "She's been silent for 3 years. 6 trained professionals have failed to help her. What makes you think you're different?" Grace knelt down beside Hei-jin, who had shrunk back during the confrontation. "Because I understand what it feels like to lose someone you love and blame yourself for not saving them." The honesty in her voice seemed to surprise Grandmother Park. For a moment, the older woman's harsh expression softened, revealing the grief she kept hidden beneath her criticism. "My son works himself to death because he can't bear what happened," she said quietly. This family is broken, Miss Thompson. We've all tried to fix it, but some things can't be repaired. Grace looked down at Heijin's drawing, at the two figures standing together in the face of tragedy. Maybe it's not about fixing what's broken, Mrs. Park. Maybe it's about building something new from the pieces that remain. As Grandmother Park left the room in thoughtful silence, Grace noticed Heijin had picked up her crayon again. This time, she was adding color to the figures in her drawing, warm browns and gentle yellows that spoke of hope beginning to bloom in the darkness.
Junho arrived home earlier than usual that evening, his briefcase forgotten in the car as he stood in the doorway of Heijin's playroom. What he saw made him question everything he thought he knew about his daughter's condition. Heijin was sitting cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed in creating what appeared to be a detailed map of their old neighborhood. Grace sat beside her, not directing or instructing, simply present as the child worked through her memories with colored pencils. For the first time in 3 years, Heijin looked peaceful. "She's been working on this for 2 hours," Grace said softly, noticing his presence. "She's drawn every building, every street corner. Look here, she even included the small flower shop where your wife used to buy roses." Junho's breath caught in his throat. He had forgotten about that flower shop, about how his wife would surprise him with white roses every Friday, claiming they brought good luck for the weekend. The detail in Heijin's drawing was extraordinary. She had remembered things he had forced himself to forget. "How did you get her to do this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't get her to do anything," Grace replied, her Nigerian accent soft in the evening light. "I just gave her the tools to express what was already inside her heart." As if sensing her father's presence, Heijin looked up. Their eyes met for the first time in months, really met, without the usual wall of pain and avoidance between them. She held up her drawing, pointing to a small figure she had drawn standing in front of their old apartment building. The figure wore a business suit and carried a briefcase, but his face was sad and empty. Junho knelt down slowly, his expensive suit creasing against the floor. Is that me?" Heijin nodded, then pointed to another figure in the drawing, a little girl watching from a balcony, her mouth covered by dark scribbles. The message was clear. They had both been trapped in their own ways since the accident. "Mr. Park," Grace said gently, "when did you last spend time with Heijin, not just checking on her, but actually being present with her?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He tried to remember the last time he had sat with his daughter, really sat with her, without his phone buzzing or his mind racing through business problems. The memory felt impossibly distant, buried under 3 years of guilt and avoidance. I work to provide for her. Everything I do is for her future." Grace's dark eyes held no judgment, only understanding. "She doesn't need your money, Mr. Park. She needs her father." That night, for the first time since the accident, Junho didn't retreat to his home office after dinner. Instead, he found himself drawn back to Heijin's room, where Grace was helping her prepare for bed. He watched from the doorway as Grace braided Heijin's long black hair, humming a gentle melody that seemed to ease the tension from her daughter's small shoulders. "May I?" he asked hesitantly, gesturing toward the hairbrush. Grace smiled and stepped aside. Junho's hands shook slightly as he took over the simple task he hadn't performed since his wife's death. Heijin stiffened at first, then gradually relaxed as muscle memory took over. He had done this countless times when she was younger, back when bedtime stories and goodnight kisses were part of their routine. "Your hair is getting so long," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Mama always said it was like silk." Heijin turned in her chair, studying his face with those wise, dark eyes that seemed too old for a 12-year-old. She reached up and touched his cheek, her small finger tracing the path of a tear he hadn't realized had fallen.
Grace watched the interaction with professional satisfaction, and something else, something that made her heart beat faster when Junho looked at her with gratitude and something deeper. She pushed the feeling away, reminding herself that she was here for Jin, not for the complicated emotions stirring in her chest whenever the girl's father was near. As Junho tucked Jin into bed, he noticed a new drawing on her nightstand. It showed 3 figures standing together under a bright sun: a man, a woman with dark skin, and a little girl. All 3 were smiling, and for the first time in any of Jin's artwork, no one's mouth was covered by shadows. The thunderstorm arrived without warning, turning the Seoul sky black at 3 in the afternoon. Grace was helping Jin with a watercolor painting when the first crack of thunder shook the mansion's windows. The little girl's paintbrush clattered to the floor as her body went rigid with terror. "It's okay, sweetheart," Grace said softly, but she could already see the familiar signs of panic taking hold. Jin's breathing became shallow and rapid, her eyes wide with the same fear that had consumed her 3 years ago. The accident had happened during a storm just like this one. Grace had learned this detail from young Soo, the family driver, who still blames himself for not being available to drive Mrs. Park that terrible night. The rain, the thunder, the flashing lightning, it all transported Jin back to that balcony where she had watched her world burn. Another thunderclap echoed through the house, and Jin bolted from her chair, running to the corner of the room where she curled into a tight ball, her hands pressed over her ears. Grace followed slowly, her heart breaking as she watched the child retreat into the protective shell she had built around her trauma. "The storm can't hurt you here," Grace whispered, sitting on the floor nearby, but not touching. "You're safe inside with me." But Jin was lost in her memories, her small body shaking with each rumble of thunder. Grace knew that words alone wouldn't reach her now. She needed something stronger, something that could cut through the wall of fear and guilt that trapped the child's voice. Grace began to hum, the same lullaby her grandmother had sung during the fierce storms that swept across Lagos. The melody was ancient and soothing, passed down through generations of women who understood that music could heal what words could not touch. Slowly, she added her voice to the tune, singing softly in Yoruba. The foreign words seemed to penetrate Jin's panic in a way that English or Korean could not. The child's breathing began to slow, her rigid posture softening slightly as the unfamiliar melody wrapped around her like a protective blanket. "My grandmother taught me that song," Grace said gently, switching back to English. She said it was magic, that it could chase away the darkest storms and the scariest monsters. The child lifted her head slightly, her tear-stained face turned toward Grace with cautious curiosity. "Would you like to know what the words mean?" Grace asked. A tiny nod was her answer, the first voluntary response Jin had made during a panic episode. "It says, 'Little bird with broken wings, the storm will pass and you will sing. The rain will wash your tears away and bring the sunshine of a new day.'" As if summoned by the song, Jin slowly uncurled from her protective position. She crawled closer to Grace, close enough that Grace could feel the child's trembling gradually subside. "Sometimes," Grace continued, "we think our voices are too small to matter, too weak to change anything. But that's not true, Jin. Your voice is powerful, even when it's silent." The storm raged outside, but inside the playroom, a different kind of breakthrough was happening. Jin reached for the art supplies scattered on the floor and began to draw with urgent, desperate strokes. Grace watched as a new picture emerged, not the usual scenes of the accident, but something different. It was a drawing of the balcony from that terrible night, but this time the little girl wasn't alone. There were other figures with her: Grace, her father, even Grandmother Park. And most importantly, the little girl's mouth wasn't covered by shadows. Instead, there were small lines coming from her lips, representing sound, representing voice. "You want to tell me something about that night?" Jin nodded, then showed her throat and shook her head sadly. She drew another picture, this one showing herself screaming at the burning car, her mouth wide open in a silent cry for help.
You think if you had screamed louder, someone might have heard you. You think your voice could have saved her. Tears streamed down Hagen's face as she nodded again. Finally, the truth was emerging. The guilt that had stolen her voice wasn't just about surviving when her mother didn't. It was about the terrible belief that her silence had somehow contributed to the tragedy. From the doorway, Junho watched in amazement as Grace gently helped Haejin confront the demons that had haunted her for 3 years. He had never seen anyone reach Haejin so completely, and he found himself falling deeper under Grace's spell with each passing moment. The weeks following the thunderstorm breakthrough brought changes that rippled through the Park mansion like gentle waves. Junho found himself canceling meetings, delegating responsibilities, and arriving home before sunset for the first time in 3 years. The corporate world buzzed with speculation about the CEO's sudden shift in priorities, but he no longer cared about boardroom gossip. What mattered was the way Haejin's face lit up when he walked through the door each evening. What mattered was being present for the small victories Grace helped his daughter achieve. The first time she nodded yes to a direct question, the day she drew a picture of their family smiling, the afternoon she actually reached for his hand during a walk in the garden. "She's responding to having both of us here," Grace explained one evening as they watched Haejin arrange her art supplies with careful precision. Children heal faster when they feel secure in their relationships. Junho studied Grace's profile as she spoke, noting the way the lamplight caught the warm undertones in her dark skin, how her eyes sparkled with genuine affection when she looked at his daughter. Somewhere between the art therapy sessions and the quiet dinners, his feelings for Grace had evolved from gratitude to something much deeper and more complicated. "Grace," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." She turned to face him, and the air between them seemed to shimmer with unspoken possibilities. "What is it?" Before he could answer, Grandmother Park entered the room, her expression troubled. "Junho, we need to discuss the situation with Miss Thompson." The older woman's tone carried an edge that made Grace's stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. She had faced this kind of disapproval before, the subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that she was an outsider, that her presence was temporary, that she didn't truly belong in their world. "What situation, Mother?" Junho's voice carried a warning. "The neighbors are talking. Mrs. Kim from the penthouse mentioned seeing you and Miss Thompson walking together in the garden. People are beginning to assume, well, they're making assumptions about the nature of her employment here." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had been careful to maintain professional boundaries, but she couldn't deny the growing connection between herself and Junho. The way he looked at her during Haejin's therapy sessions, the lingering conversations over dinner, the moments when their hands accidentally touched while helping his daughter, it all added up to something that transcended a simple employer-employee relationship. "Let them talk," Junho said firmly. "Grace has brought more healing to this family in 2 months than we've seen in 3 years. I'm not questioning her abilities, but you must consider Haejin's stability. What happens when Miss Thompson's contract ends? What happens when she returns to her own country? The child has already lost one mother figure." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She had been so focused on Haejin's daily progress that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the future, about the inevitable end of her time with this family. Her visa was temporary, her savings limited. Eventually, she would have to return to Nigeria or find another position elsewhere. "Perhaps," Grace said quietly, "we should focus on what's best for Haejin right now, rather than worrying about hypothetical futures." But even as she spoke, she could see the doubt creeping into Junho's eyes. The reality of their different worlds, his wealth and status, her temporary visa and uncertain future, suddenly felt like an insurmountable barrier. That night, as Grace helped Haejin prepare for bed, the little girl seemed to sense the tension in the air. She drew a picture of 3 figures standing together, but this time she added dark clouds hovering overhead. When she showed it to Grace, her eyes were filled with a wisdom that seemed far too mature for her 12 years.
"You're worried about something," Grace observed. Hei-jin nodded, then pointed to the clouds in her drawing. She drew another picture, the same 3 figures, but now they were separated by a wide river, reaching towards each other but unable to touch. Grace's heart clenched as she realized that Hei-jin understood more about the adult complications swirling around her than anyone had given her credit for. The child who had been silent for 3 years was communicating her deepest fears through art, the fear of losing another person she had grown to love. "Sometimes," Grace whispered, "love finds a way to bridge even the widest rivers." But as she tucked Hei-jin into bed, Grace wondered if she was making a promise she couldn't keep.
6 months later, the Park Mansion buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in years. White roses, the same kind Hei-jin's mother used to buy, adorned every surface, their sweet fragrance mixing with the sound of laughter, echoing through halls that had been silent for too long. Grace stood before the full-length mirror in what had once been a guest room but was now her permanent home, adjusting the simple but elegant white dress that Grandmother Park had insisted on buying for her. The older woman had surprised everyone by becoming Grace's fiercest supporter once she realized that her son's happiness and her granddaughter's healing were intertwined with this remarkable young woman from Nigeria. "You look beautiful," Hei-jin said from the doorway, her voice clear and strong. The words still sent shivers of joy through Grace's heart, even though Hei-jin had been speaking regularly for the past 4 months. The breakthrough had come during a family dinner when Grandmother Park had mentioned that Grace's visa was expiring and she might need to return to Nigeria. The thought of losing the woman who had become her anchor had shattered Hei-jin's carefully constructed walls completely. "No," she had screamed, the word exploding from her lips with 3 years of pent-up emotion. "Grace can't leave. She's my family now." The room had fallen silent, everyone staring at the little girl who had just spoken her first words since the accident. But Hei-jin wasn't finished. "Papa," she had continued, tears streaming down her face, "I want Grace to be my new mama because she taught me that love speaks all languages. She showed me that my voice matters, that I matter. Please don't let her go." Junho had dropped to his knees beside his daughter's chair, his own eyes filled with tears. "Hei-jin, do you really want Grace to stay with us forever?" "Forever and always," Hei-jin had whispered, then looked directly at Grace. "Will you be my mama? Not to replace my first mama, but to love me like she did." Grace had been unable to speak through her tears, but her nod had been answer enough. That's when Junho had taken her hand and said the words that changed everything. "Grace Thompson, will you marry me? Will you help me build a new kind of family from the pieces of our broken hearts?" Now, as Grace prepared to walk down the aisle in the mansion's garden, she marveled at how love had indeed found a way to bridge every river that had seemed too wide to cross. Junho had used his business connections to help her secure permanent residency. Grandmother Park had embraced her with the fierce protectiveness of a mother welcoming her daughter home. And Hei-jin had blossomed into a confident, talkative child who served as the flower girl with pride. "Are you ready?" Junho asked, appearing in the doorway in his perfectly tailored black suit. The transformation in him was as remarkable as his daughter's. The cold, distant businessman had been replaced by a warm, present father and partner. "I've been ready since the day I first heard Hei-jin laugh," Grace replied, taking his offered arm. The ceremony was small, but perfect, held in the garden where Grace had first helped Hei-jin plant flowers as part of her therapy. Young-soo served as Junho's best man, tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched the family he had served for so long finally find happiness again. When it came time for the vows, Hei-jin stepped forward with a piece of paper in her hands. "I wrote something," she announced to the small gathering of family and friends. "Grace came to our house when everything was dark and quiet. She didn't try to fix me or make me talk. She just loved me until I remembered how to love myself. She taught Papa how to be my daddy again, and she taught me that families can be made in lots of different ways. Today, she's not just marrying Papa, she's choosing to be my mama forever, and I'm choosing her right back."
There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as Grace knelt down to embrace her new daughter. "I love you, Hagen, forever and always." "I love you too, Mama Grace," Hagen whispered back. As the sun set over Seoul, the Park family, now complete with their newest member, celebrated not just a wedding, but the triumph of love over loss, voice over silence, and hope over despair. Grace had come to Korea seeking a fresh start, but she had found something infinitely more precious, a family that proved love truly could speak all languages.